Have you ever sat through a lecture just furiously taking notes, only to realize, maybe a week later, that you've forgotten pretty much all of it? Yeah, me too. Well, it turns out there's a really good reason for that. And back in the 90s, a Harvard physicist figured out a brilliant way to fix it. So today, we're going to break down his method, which turns learning into an active, social, and honestly, a surprisingly effective process. Let's just start with a thought that might kind of flip how you think about education. What if the best teacher in any given room isn't the one with the PhD at the front? What if it's actually the person sitting right next to you who just wrapped their head around a tough concept like 5 minutes ago? That's the wild idea we're going to dig into. You know the scene, right? We've all been there. The professor's up front explaining something super complex, and the entire room is silent except for the sound of keyboards and scribbling. Information is definitely being transmitted at you, but is it actually being understood? This is the core of the silent classroom problem. Because just listening isn't learning. Passively soaking up information is, it turns out, a fantastic recipe for forgetting it. Okay, so this brings us to our hero, Eric Mazur. Now, by all accounts, he was a great Harvard physics professor. His students got awesome grades, he got glowing reviews. Everything looked perfect on the surface. But he just had this nagging feeling that despite all the A's, his students weren't really getting it. And then came the aha moment. Or maybe it was more of an oh no moment. He gave his class a really simple conceptual question. When a big, heavy truck smashes into a small stationary car, which one exerts more force on the other? Now, these are Harvard physics students who could solve incredibly complex equations in their sleep, but the vast majority of them got it wrong. They just felt like the truck had to be hitting harder. They could recite Newton's third law, sure, but they didn't fundamentally understand what it meant. That shocking realization is what led Mazur to create a whole new method from the ground up, peer instruction. At its heart, it's an interactive approach that's designed to get students past just memorizing formulas and instead build a deep, real, lasting understanding. And the key? Having them explain things to each other. All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts here. How does this thing actually work in a classroom? Because it's not just, telling students to chat amongst yourselves. It's a very specific, highly structured cycle designed to find confusion and crush it in real time. So here's the loop. First, the teacher gives a super short mini lecture on just one key idea. Then they throw out a tricky conceptual question, one that's designed to trip students up on common misunderstandings. Every student thinks about it and votes on their own. And now here's the magic part. They turn to their neighbors and they argue about it. They debate their answers. After a few minutes of that, everybody votes a second time. And only then does the teacher step in to explain the right answer and clear up any final confusion. And this process totally transforms the teacher's job. They go from being the sage on the stage, the one person who holds all the knowledge, to being the guide on the side. Their job is to spark the conversation, listen in to hear where students are getting stuck, and then step in to help guide them toward the answer. And get this, the whole thing is incredibly smart because it's data-driven. That first vote tells the teacher exactly what to do next. If fewer than 30% of the students get it right, well, the explanation didn't work. Time to stop and reteach it a different way. If more than 70% get it right, awesome, they can briefly confirm and move on. But that sweet spot, right between 30 and 70%, that's the perfect zone for pure discussion to work its magic. So the big question is, does it actually work? Does all this talking really lead to better learning? Well, let's go back to that original truck and car question to see exactly what happened. The proof is right here in the numbers. It's pretty staggering. Before the discussion, only about 40% of his students got the right answer. Remember, these are Harvard physics students. But after just 2 or 3 minutes of talking it over with each other, that number jumped to 80% correct. That's a massive leap in understanding, and it happened in minutes. So why? Why is this so effective? Well, it taps into a simple but incredibly powerful truth about our brains. The act of having to explain an idea out loud, of having to defend your reasoning and convince someone else, it forces you to clean up your own thinking. It literally forges stronger connections in your brain, turning shaky knowledge into rock-solid understanding. This also gets at a really interesting psychological quirk that experts have. It's called the curse of knowledge. See, an expert professor has known something for so long, they've completely forgotten what it feels like not to know it. But a student who just figured it out, They still remember the struggle. They know exactly what was confusing, and they can explain it in simple, relatable language because they were just in that same boat. And the impact of this method goes way, way beyond just getting a better score on a test. It really does start a small revolution in the classroom, fundamentally changing the environment and the kind of skills that students walk away with. I mean, just look at this list of benefits. Students don't just get a better grade. They develop a much deeper conceptual understanding. They're way more engaged, they remember the information for longer, and studies show that failure and dropout rates often plummet. But just as important, they're building these crucial life skills: how to think critically, how to make a coherent argument, and how to work with others to solve a tough problem. And here's the kicker: it's not just effective, students actually like it. In one major study, a whopping 88% of students had a positive opinion of the method. And you know how many had a negative review? 0. Not one. They find it more fun, more engaging, and, at the end of the day, a better way to learn. So if we boil this all down, what's the big takeaway? It's this: real, meaningful learning is not a spectator sport. It's not something you can just passively absorb from the sidelines. It has to be an active and, as it turns out, a social process. It's a team sport. In the end, what Eric Mazur stumbled upon challenges a model of education that's been around for centuries. It's a powerful reminder that the goal of teaching shouldn't be to just cover the material, but to help students uncover a real understanding. So if learning happens when we're thinking, not just when we're listening, it really makes you wonder, what are we waiting for?